Well, hello, everybody, and I'd like to welcome everyone to today's special WebEx. I am Robin Keeler. I'm an industrial hygienist with DOE's Office of Worker Safety and Health Policy, so I'd just like to welcome everyone and welcome our speakers today. And today will be the third and final part of a three-part series on an introduction to exposure assessment strategies and statistics. And today's part 3 is on improvement. So before we get officially started, since we are recording, I am going to read a recording statement. We lost our slides, but Joe's getting them back.
Sorry, just momentarily. I apologize.
It's no problem. It's no problem. I'll go ahead and read it. So this WebEx call is being recorded, and it may be posted on DOE's website or used internally. If you do not wish to have your voice recorded, please do not speak during the call or disconnect now. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, please turn off your camera or participate.
Your microphone doesn't seem to be working.
Okay, Joe, can you hear me?
Yes. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Go ahead, Robin.
Okay. Am I still garbled, or is it coming through clear?
Should be fine.
All right. Okay, good. Thanks for the comments, everybody. It looks like it's okay now. So let me start over with the recording acknowledgement. So this WebEx call is being recorded and may be posted on DOE's website or used internally. If you do not wish to have your voice recorded, please do not speak during the call or disconnect now. If you do not wish to have your image recorded, please turn off your camera or participate only by phone. And if you speak during the call or use a video connection, you are presumed to consent to recording and to the use of your voice or image. And just a note that our Q&A at the end of the presentation will not be recorded. So for today's agenda, as I mentioned at the beginning, this is part 3 of our exposure monitoring series, which is improvement. Our two speakers today are Mr. Andrew Perkins and Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Ferrieri. And as I mentioned, we will have a Q&A at the end. So feel free to type in your questions into the chat box, and we'll get to those at the end. And when we are at the end, you can hit *6 to unmute yourself and ask your question if you wish to just verbalize your question. Next slide. Some of our announcements. So today, of course, is the last of the series. The slides for each part are posted at the IHOS Special Interest Group website. The link is right there, and the recording for parts 1 and 2 are now available at the website there, and we did send out an email with those links, and after today's WebEx, we'll send out that information again as well. And once part 3 is available, we'll let people know when that's up. Last week, it only took a couple days for that recording to be posted, so we're hoping it's that quick this time around. Next slide. So we are offering certificates of completion. They'll be available after today's WebEx. The certificates will be provided through the NIOSH Education and Research Center. and that's from the Deep South ERC at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. And as we've done in past WebExes, your name and email, if you would provide that at the end of the feedback survey, that's how you'll get your certificate, and we will send out that link to that survey either this afternoon or by tomorrow. Next slide. So quick bio for both of our speakers. Andrew Perkins, he has worked in the occupational and safety health field since 1999. He's currently the corporate senior industrial hygienist at Alabama's Power, a Southern company. He holds a BS in computer information systems and an MS in occupational safety and health and industrial hygiene from Murray State University in Kentucky. And he has earned the professional credentials of CIH, CSP, and the Certified Occupational Hearing Conservationist certification. He's a member of the AIHA Exposure Assessment Strategies Committee. And our next speaker, next slide, is Lieutenant Colonel Matthew Ferrieri, and he is the Chief Occupational Health Programs currently assigned to the Air Force Medical Support Agency in Falls Church, Virginia. He leads the bioenvironmental engineering occupational health programs across the Air Force. And as a part of his duties, he oversees the Occupational Health Program Management Review and Occupational Health Management System. He also advises the Air Force Secretariat and Surgeon General on occupational health policy. He also serves as the chairman of the Department of Defense Industrial Hygiene Working Group, where he leads a diverse multi-service team providing technical and policy advice on IH issues to the Office of the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense. Environment, safety, and occupational health. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andy Perkins. So give us a couple moments to get the slides up and for Andy to take over.
There we go. Can you see the slides now?
We can see the slides and we can hear you.
Outstanding. Okay. I want to start out with thanking everybody that has stuck with us through all three of the parts of our presentation. This one's going to be a little bit different. It's still tied into parts 1 and 2, but now we're going to talk a little bit more about how to squeeze a little bit more blood out of that tournament, how to get a little bit more effectiveness and efficiency from the processes in the AIHA Sampling Strategies book. And I'm advancing. There we go. Just want to double check that first slide advanced correctly for everybody. Good deal. All right.
We see it.
So thank you. We've talked a lot about uncertainty and acceptability. And again, we're comparing against OELs. Again, without an OEL, it's hard to do an assessment. If you don't know what the benchmark is, if you don't know what the hurdle is to get over, then you don't really know what you're working with. And then those SEGs we talked about, again, that's our groupings that we've put our exposures into. So in this scenario right here, we're having an OEL that maybe has a little bit of variability in it, as we're seeing from the dot and whisker plot there. But then our SEG is the dot being really far away from the OEL, and even with the variability, which there's always going to be variability, there's people involved, there's processes that are involved. This would be a really good scenario to be in. You're far enough away from the OEL, you don't have uncertainty that overlaps. So the concepts we've been talking about, this is the graphic to help us see what we're talking about. Now this graphic tells us maybe our data shows us that we aren't in as much control as we want. If we were just doing compliance, the exposure and the OEL aren't at the same point. But whenever we add in that variability and the uncertainty that always is going to exist, then we have a little bit different decision. So this is a good graphic. Now that we know, again, that compliance sampling, whenever you're going with the OEL is 1, the sample comes back 0.999, awesome, everything's great. This shows us whenever we start thinking about it in the AIHA sampling strategy methodology, there's accounting for the uncertainty and what we don't know and the statistics. Maybe that decision isn't the safest for the people that are doing the work and to protect the organization. So good graphics for that right there. And one of the tools, we've actually mentioned it a few times on the call so far, but Bayesian statistics, Bayesian thinking really is something that is pretty new for industrial hygienists, but it's greatly usable to us because we've talked about for our last 2 meetings our qualitative and our quantitative, so what we think and then what the data says and how often we only have what we think, we don't have any data. If you could mesh those together, that'd be extremely valuable. We have the ability to do that in Bayesian, and it's a way that allows us to use statistics and our judgment and put those together and get a little bit more certainty out of that and more value out of what used to not be quantifiable at all, just our judgment. So the concept comes from Bayesian inference. It's what we should all do every day, and as we progress through our lives, we're getting new pieces of information, and that adjusts our thinking. That changes our hypothesis. So I used to think this. Now that I have new data, I might change that. Or I used to think this, and I got new data, and it validated that. So I can think that and be more confident in it. Bayesian inference is the concept that we're building from there. So all too often, we'll get into our industrial hygiene silos, and we'll think we know everything, or we think that we know a scenario while processes are changing, chemicals are changing, controls are degrading, controls are getting implemented. But whenever we get new data points, it doesn't have to be a sampling data point. Again, it could be we go out and look at a job, and it sure does look dustier, or I sure did smell more solvent than I did before. Look at it with fresh set of eyes, remake our decision each time that we go out. That's what we're talking about in Bayesian thinking. Really is helpful. It's what we already do. This is just a nice fancy way to put some statistics to it and put it in a nice box. So Bayesian decision analysis, you'll hear us say BDA a lot. So whenever we're using BDA, what that helps us get to quicker is the probability of the true exposure. So we're figuring out where an exposure scenario really does fall, really is out in the world. And again, statistics and our judgment are helping us get there. That's what we should really be doing when we're doing exposure assessment, because again, we want to make sure that we make the right decision with the information that we have. And again, there's always going to be more information that comes in. We've said the word reiterative process many, many times. This really is a reiterative process. We need to go out and actively look at exposure scenarios again and again and again. We need to actively seek information whenever something changes, and that could absolutely change our decision or just validate what we're already thinking. In BDA, we have the ability to make some decisions a little bit quicker. You can do Bayesian with as little as 1 sample. Now, we've said this. What's the most common number of industrial hygiene samples to have for a scenario? It's 0. What's the most dangerous one? 1. I got 1 data point. I think I know everything. But it helps us with those things that we just know we'll never get. I don't know about y'all, but I know we have scenarios where we have our qualitative assessment, and we have a category for this task is done less frequently than every 5 years. So it's still something we have to assess because we know it has issues, but we have to also take into we have to take into account the reality that sometimes that's a maintenance thing that only happens every 5 years. But we still need to make an assessment on what we have. Bayesian can help make sensor data analysis a lot easier. The biggest sensor data set that we're going to get are going to be those lab non-detects. So sometimes even when we get enough volume, we still get sensor data, and what you do with that can be really hard. Some of the Bayesian tools already have that built in, where you make your decision, you set it in the tool, and it'll treat that data from now on the way that you said. Now, that can be a lot harder if we have a lot of samples that are such low volume, the sensor data or the limit of detection that makes up the sensor data is super high. That can be problematic. It doesn't fix that, but it can still work with those. The biggest thing that Bayesian has done for me and my professional life is the tool that I like to use. It has nice little graphs. And the further up you go in the chain of command where I normally have to communicate, pictures help a lot. You can show people, you can show managers, you can show supervisors the pictures of this is the exposure scenario, and this is what we're working with, and this is why we need to do X, Y, or Z. It really does use the statistics to help us with the confidence in our assessment. So what I'm saying there, it validates what we're saying, or it will tell us, you think it's not a problem, the data says it's a problem, it makes it really clear, easy to see that, gives us the statistical confidence and the just general confidence in our assessments. So in Bayesian decision analysis, we've got three parts that make it up. The first is the prior, so that's our professional judgment. That could be the information that comes out of our basic characterization. Again, that's our qualitative assessment there. Likelihood, that is our quantitative, our sampling data, and that really is king whenever we're making our decisions. Our judgment's the prior, likelihood is the data drives the decision making, and it should drive the decision making. Posterior, this is where the Bayesian tools match up the prior and the likelihood and calculate out a number that integrates both of those. So we're going to look at that a little bit more, but again, we never had a way to really use that qualitative information in a quantitative manner before. Bayesian helped us do that. So here's an example right here. We have the same prior, so it's the same set of data that we're going to do analysis on the likelihood, the data. But on the priors, we have a non-informative judgment, so that means I didn't make a decision at all. It's flat, non-informative. There's nothing in there that we're feeding the computer, really, just saying everything is 20% across the board. We have an informative prior, so that's where I made a guess, and that guess was I'm confident that it's a Category 2 exposure. Again, the likelihood is still the same data right there, but you'll see as we put in our non-informative information, run it through the likelihood, we get a different posterior. It's saying that it's basically a 66% chance a Category 2. But if we take the informative prior, the, again, qualitative assessment that I made where I thought it was Category 2, put it into the likelihood, comes out as a posterior of 82% chance that it's Category 2. So it really bolsters the posterior, saying that this is probably a Category 2. Really useful graphic way to interpret our data. We have to be really careful on using posterior because of that prior, but something that anyone can use today is if you put in a prior and then look at the likelihood, you can see how close your judgment was. So let's think of if this graph, if the informative said that it is a Category 4, I'm positive that it's way overexposed, but then the likelihood comes back and shows it's Category 2, then we would see the bars differently, and that would help us understand that our judgment's wrong. Real-time way for us to adjust our judgment. Again, we're talking about improvement today. These charts used in that manner have helped me out immensely on training people to do sampling, to train people on analysis, and for me to make sure that what we thought was true, driven by the likelihood, driven by the data. So one of the tools that I really like to use is IH Data Analyst. So that's the Paul Hewitt tool. we have on this call also talked about ExpoStat. So ExpoStat, which is expostat.ca, it's a Canadian tool, I do believe it's expostat.ca, is an online tool that does something similar. I just know more about IHDA. I've just used it a lot more over the years. Not plugging one over the other, just saying those are the tools that are out there available. If you make a tool that does that works well, I will pitch it as well. Something else that's out there is the IHStat spreadsheet. So this is just an Excel spreadsheet. It doesn't have Bayesian in it, but it does give you the 95th percentile. So if you're using percent OEL data, your 95th percentile would basically tell you which AIHA category it falls into. It's available out there on the AIHA Exposure Assessment Strategies Committee website, free to use. Does a lot of graphs, a lot of automated calculations for you. It's a great tool, and it's absolutely worth the money and more. So we're going to go into a little bit deeper dive into some of our further information gathering. We've talked about this a few times in our process for the AIHA sampling strategy, but today what we want to do is figure out how can we prioritize our SEGs. In other words, what do we need to go and sample? How can we get that a little bit tighter using some of the health effects information? So we're always going to have some kind of uncertainties. We will never know 100%. That's why we're using 95th percentile, and that's why 95th percentile upper confidence is so hard to get to. To get to 100% upper confidence is impossible. Even if you sampled every scenario every day, which is never going to happen, you still wouldn't have every single scenario that could ever happen. So how are we going to make sure that those SEGs that have some kind of uncertainty in them, how are we going to get those prioritized? How are we going to make sure that we have the process for which one do we get first? Because we all have limited resources on what we can sample, when we can sample, how much money we have, whatever it is that limits us. And something that can help us with that is assessing the health effects of our agents in our exposure scenarios. Helps us understand what level of control or uncontrolled, if they're acceptable or unacceptable. So something that we have is health risk. So we're trying to get some kind of a probability on how bad something is as driven by the health risk that's associated with it. Normally toxicity, of course, is what we'd be talking about right there. And let me go back one right here and just say, in my world, we made it pretty easy. This health risk can be driven by whatever. It's not in the book. It doesn't say this is the one way you have to do it, because there is not just one way that you have to do this. What we did is we took all of our agents that we sample and we assessed a health risk ranking to them. Sometimes it was driven off of the OEL. Sometimes it was driven off of just our experience of what we were more scared of, basically. We gave it a number, again, 1 for the least scary things, 5 for the highest, and that just goes into our calculation. So some of the calculations that can be out there, again, there's not just one way. We can figure out what our health risk, what our risk is by using our exposure rating and multiply that by the health effect rating. That's basically what we did in my world, but we made it really simple for the end user. They just pick what agent they're assessing. Again, if it's arsenic, they're looking at arsenic. If they're looking at silica, they don't understand and they don't have to see what the health rating is. It's automatically cooked in our process. Some people have way more complicated ones. Something that other folks do, the exposure rating, health effects rating, uncertainty rating, you multiply all those together and you can get a risk ranking. I know of people that have 15 or 16 variables that go into their health risk rating. How often it's used, the toxicity, all kinds, the temperature that it's used in, all kinds of factors could go in there. The more complicated you make it, the more complicated it is. Again, in my world, we made it really simplistic, and it's worked well for us, and it's simple. End user, completely doesn't have to do anything. It's all cooked in for them. So why are we doing this for our SEGs? We want to make sure what we need to do next. Do we need to go and sample them? Do we need to implement controls? Do we need to get some more information? Again, whenever we get into those uncertainty scenarios, we got to have some way to prioritize those. A lot of times those are going to be those AIHA category 3s that we've mentioned so many times that are scary. They're hard to deal with, and they're ones you want to get into a category 2 or a category 4 pretty quickly. Using the health effects of it, that helps us a lot. Using the calculation to come up with a risk rating, a matrix, whatever you want to use, is extremely useful. And again, that's all to help us figure out what we need to go and get next. Help us out with our priorities. Make our list of where we're going to spend our time and money. So what you'll end up with is, once you've assessed it and you feel good about it, so I'm saying here the confidence in the health effects data. So maybe you don't know what it is. I know you guys had mentioned you have things that don't have OELs, or it's like something you're pretty confident is bad stuff, or you have no idea about it at all. That can affect where your ranking is, what kind of a calculation you use, how confident you are in that, and then the reliability of the control. So is it PPE that can fail at any time? Is it an engineering control that is well maintained and always works? This process helps us out with that. And even in the Bayesian tool, we have the ability to rank those. 0, it's actually 0, 1, or 2 in the BDA tool, in the Paul Hewitt tool that we mentioned. 0 for certain, uncertain 1, highly uncertain for 2, and it should be highly uncertain for 2. And that helps us, again, with our calculation, and just gives us one more grain of sand to put into our decision-making beach, again, the overall information that we're going to get. And what that does is gives us that ability to assess our SEGs and focus those limited resources, like I've said. It can be as simple as exposure times toxicity, like I was talking about. It can be more complicated than that. There's not just one way to do it, but what it will give us in the end is a prioritization for what our next steps are. So it really is useful. It can be simple. It can be thought of too much and made too complicated, but you get to make a process that works for you to use the risk ranking, the health risk ranking, to help you with your assessment process. And now we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
Okay, thank you. So what works best to kind of resolve that uncertainty? Well, as a classic IH, my go-to reply is, well, it depends. Models can work very, very well depending on the exposure situation. Air sampling, more air sampling. Professional judgment. Maybe you have a lot of experience with that exposure situation, or you can get a lot of experience. I've had a couple times in my career where I've had to just go hang out in a shop for 2 or 3 days and watch and take notes on what they do. You learn interesting things, like I was doing some air sampling on, it was a milling machine working on carbon fiber for B-2 landing gear doors. And we'd ask the worker all kinds of questions of it. It was kind of a walk-in type milling machine, very big. Did he ever go in there? And he goes, oh, no, never. And we're kind of watching him as we're doing some air sampling. And he pauses the machine, opens up the safety door, walks in, takes out his vacuum, and he vacuums it up. We're like, I thought you never went in there. He goes, I don't, except for that. So those are the kind of things where your professional judgment can add something to it of, oh, I know precisely where the exposure is and where I need to control it. Next slide. So when making decisions about the exposure, limited sample size monitoring can be very overvalued. Andrew talked earlier about how 0 is the most common and 1 sample is the most dangerous. I talked about, I think on the first day, I like to ask folks when I was an instructor, would you rather have 0 or 1 samples? And they'd all say 1, and I said, no, I would rather have 0 because at least I know I'm guessing. Because you can get that if you remember that log normal distribution, it's very heavily skewed left, where it's a lot of the data is hanging out in the very low range, far more than, say, like a normal distribution that we're very comfortable with. Because of that, you can not in your mind, not intuit very well of, oh, look, I've got these 2 pieces of data. It must be fine. And you won't intuit very well what you're doing. And then also, a lot of folks will confuse kind of individual sample accuracy, so the actual accuracy of the precise management versus reality at the time. And there's some accuracy, and you'll see all this in the NIOSH Manual of Analytical Methods. And it'll talk about that. And this is what we get, your upper and lower confidence limits on the sample. And they'll confuse that level of accuracy with the worker accuracy and variation. So that difference between, worker A and worker B, the difference between worker A today and worker A tomorrow or next week or next month. And the analytical accuracy is far insignificant compared to that worker variation between workers and days, day shift versus night shift. Did the worker drink their coffee this morning or skip their coffee this morning? And that has far more influence and far more levels of variability than the actual sample accuracy. And then additionally, modeling may be undervalued. Sometimes the models, people don't value them like they should. Lack of user understanding, like how much do you know about the model? Lack of confidence, lack of consistent, rigorous validation. I developed some modeling tools for the Air Force to use based on the sheet. There's another Excel sheet on the AHA website for called IHMod. And I kind of limited the inputs to make sure folks didn't kind of keep adding assumptions to their models till they got the answer they wanted. Once you got to a certain point, hey, you need to go air sample. But models can be extremely valuable if you can show with a relatively simple model that there is no physical possibility of an overexposure. Well, that's really tremendously valuable data. Like they simply do not use enough of the hazardous material for it to be hazardous. It won't breach that OEL. Next slide. Can we improve our judgments? Absolutely. And one of the best ways is statistical tools, because it's not a judgment per se. It's math, where your own biases aren't involved. Your own, you're a union employee. Oh, you work for the employer. Oh, you just want to have to come back here and get more data. None of those kind of poor motives can be put on you, because you say, no, this is my data. I use these standard statistical tools, and this is what they told me. And it is a very helpful thing, and it's far better than your intuition. Next slide. So, traditional stats, I am a massive fan of the IHStat web sheet. I've used it a great deal over my career, especially because as an Air Force, bioenvironmental engineer in the Air Force really values a number to go against that exposure. And using 95th percentile has been very helpful. We're able to transmit that data to the VA for disability rankings. I was the second person in the Air Force to use Bayesian decision analysis. I've used it for a lot with priors. So I saw a question earlier on the chat, what would be a good view of a prior? A couple of them could be, I've used it when I was doing some beryllium sampling on the F-22 fighter aircraft and didn't have a lot of data. I only had 2 or 3 data points at my location, but another location had 5 or 6 data points. They had done a more rigorous sampling campaign. They'd put more time into it. And I use their sample values as my prior, and I use my sampling data, and that gave me kind of the outflow there, the integrated exposure assessment. That was very, very useful. I've used priors as pre-existing data and then added the new data as well. So both of these tools can be very, very helpful depending on kind of the culture and nature of your organization. I've leaned more personally on the traditional statistics just because the Air Force and Department of Defense very much likes a number and it doesn't spit out a number with BDA. Next slide. So qualitative exposure judgment. So qualitative meaning we don't have any data. That would be quantitative. So the inputs, basic characterization, training experience. You know, you have like the gonculator, that black box where it's going to put out something, and you have outputs. You know, exposure estimate, hazard estimate, uncertainty, acceptability estimate, where you have to come up with all of this and you don't know a lot about it. And there are some journal articles out there saying that our exposure judgments is rather poor, that we tend to underestimate exposures, mostly because it's a logarithmic scale, and we as humans do a very poor job at intuiting logarithmic because we're far more accustomed to a normal distribution. So you're having to come up with all of these things, and we're not the best at it. Next slide. You know, so that qualitative decision, you have to come up with there's a good view of hey, I'm thinking it's an exposure profile. There's a good logarithmic profile there, and kind of where am I? You know, category 1, 2, 3, or 4. You know, noting that we use the decision statistic of the 95th percentile. So I think that 95% of that decision statistic of the 95th percentile is above the OEL, below, well below, those types of things. And then what controls do I need to do? Above 50%, exposure surveillance, medical surveillance, work practices where you kind of maybe fine tune some practices. Above the OEL, respirators, engineering controls, more rigorous work practice controls, et cetera, et cetera. So, but you're having to potentially come up with that with no numbers, which can be a big challenge in a lot of areas. Next slide. So building feedback into your exposure systems to confirm results. So we've talked, and we'll say it again. This is iterative. This is very much an iterative process. The journey of 1,000 miles begins with but a single step. Because what's going to happen is it's not like any of us are industrial hygienists at a operation with like a process done by everyone. You're going to have multiple processes, multiple workers. Each worker is going to accomplish multiple processes with different exposures. So you're going to have to iterate because you're never going to have the time to say, well, I'm going to look at this one of my 100 processes and I'm going to work on it for the next 3 months and I'm going to learn everything I need to know. We still got 99 out there that you haven't looked at. So you're going to do that initial judgment. Maybe you'll get a bit of exposure monitoring. I'm a big fan of trying to shoot for 3 samples on that first bit of exposure monitoring. You're going to use that when the results come back to revise your judgment. Well, that new revised judgment, when you're able to go back out again, now is your initial judgment. You'll get a couple more samples. Maybe you're only able to get 1 or 2 samples. Maybe there is a mandate with some of the OSHA expanded standard chemicals, those substance-specific standards where it requires some monitoring. And you're able to get 1 or 2 samples every 6 months or every year. And you can keep revising and keep revising. And you just keep doing this over and over until you get to a point where you're very confident. Say the hexavalent chromium standards has an option that once you've accomplished enough of that semi-annual or annual sampling, that you can say, hey, I've figured out what my exposure profile is, and just assert it, and then just kind of go back as you need. Next slide. And then you validate. You finally get to that validation. Next slide. Where, hey, I think I got it. So the expected exposure, an effective and efficient exposure risk management opportunities moving forward, because you have to be effective, and you want to be as efficient as you possibly can. And that's really about where you put your efforts. The better position for the IH professional is appropriately to use all available tools. Where can you use judgment? Like, hey, I've seen this process 10 times at the 10 locations within my organization. Be it 10 different shops at your location, 10 different shops at 10 different locations, each at its, it's an analog to each other. And I've sampled in all of them if they have this level of control profile. I've sampled many just like this, workers doing it about the same way. It's not an issue, or it's absolutely an issue. I need to put them in controls and get some sampling to confirm that the controls are adequate. But you can have that, like bringing in data from other locations that are maybe doing it the same way. Monitoring results, sample, sample, sample. I'm a big fan of sampling. I think it's really where you learn the most, both in a quantitative level, but you also learn a lot qualitatively by just talking with the workers, letting them brag about what they do. Then exposure monitoring. For a lot of those kind of edge case scenarios for exposure monitoring where I've used this a great deal with the substance-specific standards, especially like formaldehyde and things of that nature, where there's a little bit of it requires an assessment, and I'm able to kind of exclude it from needing further air sampling because they simply don't use enough. It can help you with the, hey, what should I do some monitoring? Because really, if you look at the plot there to the right, if it's green, you shouldn't have to go back that often to resample. If it's red, if you just need to control it, why would you do air sampling if you already know you need to control? If you do one sample and that first sample comes back 10 times the limit, you're going to have to control it because the amount of data it would take to refute that sample is just going to be insurmountable. You're going to want to do some level of change, some level of control, either a process change, what materials they're using, engineering controls of some kind, and then reaccomplish sampling on that new process. Really where you need to put your efforts is in that middle, that uncertain area where you just don't know if you're green or red. You've got a couple of samples, can't really do statistics yet, I need more data. And you want to use all of that and then come back again and accomplish again. Next slide. So tips for successful IH data management. The exposure assessment strategy book here, a strategy for assessing and managing occupational exposures. We're up to the 4th edition. I've got a copy of the 4th and the 3rd. I love them. They are great. But data management is so key to this because especially in an organization like the Department of Energy, very similar to the Department of Defense, multiple locations, multiple workers doing multiple different operations. You need to gather and document that data and store it, especially because most of your locations are going to have multiple industrial hygienists and technicians where it may not be you going back out to that shop. And so the next person needs to be able to say, hey, why did they do this? And I've always been, it's not that they're, that good documentation isn't about them saying you were incorrect. It's really about them saying, oh, it was different back then. While this control scheme was completely accurate 2 years ago, there's been a change in the process, a change in material, a change in throughput. As an Air Force guy, I've never, ever had it where, yeah, we've built this to do 5 a week. And you come back out in a couple of months to do some air sampling. Well, they said we needed to do 20, so we've increased output. And you're like, oh, dear, it's totally different. Really defining your segs well. And we talked about that, I think, in the first or the second presentation on how to define segs. With data or as a judgment. I'm a big fan of both, where it's one part, how do the workers self-organize themselves, and one part, what does the data tell me? And then a lot of it is then get to an electronic system that fits your needs. So DoD uses DOORS, the Defense Occupational and Environmental Health Readiness System. There are several civilian off-the-shelf tools out there. I've seen a lot smaller companies put together pretty decent access databases. More mid-tier tend to go to a commercial option because they need the support. but coming up with a way to store your data, to store your comments and your judgments so that the next person can say, oh, I totally see where they were going, but that is not the case now. Or, oh, it's just like it used to be. I did a little snooping around, a little looking around, and it's just like it was. They're working it the same way. They got about the same throughput. I was able to get one piece of data, and it worked well. Next slide. So tips for a successful IH data management system. Simplification of the analysis by storing using %OELs. Basically, my data system that I use, you put in the actual, parts per million or milligrams per meters cubed value, but you also put in the OEL. So it knows that and it can pop it out in %OEL because that's a very easy value to show to management or workplace leadership. Selection of historical data to be used in analysis, where I didn't get 6 samples this year, but over the past 3 years, I've got 6 good representative samples, and I can now do some really high-end statistics because I've been able to slowly, take one bite at the apple, take a second bite at the apple, and eventually I'll have the data I need. Include judgment improving IH calibration into your system. We talked about the prior and the likelihood. Hey, I thought X and then it ended up being Y. So what did I miss? Be a Bayesian thinker. And then also, kind of the coup de grace is use statistical tools in your system. I know the DoD system does both BDA and actually includes the IH stat spreadsheet as a downloadable so that we can attach it to our exposure judgments so we can show, hey, this is what we got. Next slide. So that's kind of the end of this presentation. I think we're real good on time now. I've got 13:46 my time. Really going to open it back up for questions. And what does everyone have questions about at this point?
Thanks, Andy. Thank you, Matt. Matthew, I think we did have the question on that you answered.